York Times is now reporting that Representative Matt Gaetz had allegedly paid money and other favors in order to engage in sexual relationships. Now, this is aside from the allegation regarding a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old minor. Again, aside from that, we're learning that he recruited women online for sex, which doesn't sound like it should be considered that big of a deal, except it is, considering there were drugs involved. And since there are drugs involved, it could be considered coercion under federal charges. Now, again, these are all allegations right now, and this is what we know. So a Justice Department investigation into Representative Matt Gaetz and an indicted Florida politician is focusing on their involvement with multiple women who were recruited online for sex and received cash payments, according to people close to the investigation. And this is important, text messages and payment receipts reviewed by the New York Times. Now, Good Morning America has some more creepy and uncomfortable details to share with you. Let's take a look.
Investigators believe Gaetz's associate, Joel Greenberg, introduced him to women Greenberg met on different websites, inviting them to Florida hotels as recently as last year, allegedly laying out how much they would be willing to pay beforehand, sometimes giving them cash from the hotel's ATM, and that some of the encounters reportedly included the drug ecstasy.
So, the fact that there were drugs involved, first of all, paying for sex, paying cold hard cash for sex is still considered a crime. I have a different belief system on that. I think prostitution should be legalized and regulated to keep people safe, but for now it's not. So that in and of itself is a crime. And then the added layer of drugs is also a potential problem for Matt Gaetz, which I'll get into more details about in just a minute. But first, I wanted to get some initial thoughts from you guys. Alyssa, starting with you.
I would say that my focus is still on the 17-year-old and whether that allegation is true. I like you, don't really, my issue with sex workers or whether or not it's an issue that he paid these people to have sex with him, I don't think that that is necessarily an issue. I care more about the sexual assault allegation with the 17-year-old.
Yeah, I hear you. One thing that I do want to bring up though is it seems like Matt Gaetz got implicated in the investigation into his political ally from Florida. So, apparently they were investigating him for sex trafficking, and while they were doing so, the investigation became a little broader to include Matt Gaetz. So I'm wondering if there's coercion involved. It seems like there were some hints of that in the piece, and obviously, if there is coercion involved, if there is drugging involved, that kind of stuff, then that's a problem. The problem is we don't really know yet, right? We just know that this is also part of the investigation. But for all the details we do know at the moment, I agree with you. The trafficking a minor for sex is a far more serious charge as far as we know so far. Woz, what do you think?
So many things come to mind. First of all, I want to say how Anna is one of the best in the business is that she kept a straight face throughout this entire ordeal. I don't know how you were able to do that. Second of all, what they described in the New York Times, those websites where you're looking for women who, in exchange for sex, will receive gifts and massages and all of that. From what I know, and don't ask me how I know this, I think that's the Sugar Baby website. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, and I just thought that was interesting.
Never.
That Matt Gaetz was into that sort of thing. And the craziest thing about all of this is that if Matt Gaetz would have just had sex with a 17-year-old girl and not paid her and not brought her across state lines and did nothing else, it would be completely legal. That's kind of the craziest part about this to me. Like the legal age of consent, depending on the state, goes from 16, 17. There are states where it's 15 years old, but 17 generally, that's a legal act. But because there were drugs involved, because there was money involved, it becomes this whole other thing with the other women specifically. And again, like you mentioned, Anna, I don't see anything wrong with recreational drug usage. I don't see anything wrong with sex work. I do see something wrong with a grown man having sex with a 17-year-old. But again, the part of it that just blows my mind is that had he not paid for it, this would be completely legal.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it does depend on the state where the sex happened, right? If they hadn't traveled, if he hadn't paid for her travel. So like some of these laws do need to be updated. But what's interesting about Matt Gaetz, if you look at his whole history, is the fact that he's gotten in trouble with the law before, and he relied on his daddy to protect him when he was caught driving under the influence. And when you get this feeling that you are above the law and you're always gonna have your dad to come in and bail you out, well, I mean, the sense that I get from Matt Gaetz and how incredibly sloppy he was in his behavior and his creepiness makes me think that he saw himself as above the law, as untouchable, because he did engage in incredibly stupid behavior. I mean, almost as if he didn't even think that getting caught would lead to any type of criminal investigation. So the Times reviewed receipts from the Cash App, a mobile payments app, and Apple Pay that show payments from Gaetz to Joel Greenberg. That's the initial person who was being investigated for sex trafficking, to one of the women. So you can see the paper trail of where the money went, or the digital trail of where the money went, and a payment from Greenberg to a second woman. The women told their friends that the payments were for sex with the two men, according to two people familiar with the conversations. Some of the men and women took ecstasy in a legal mood, blah, 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 blah. I know they're gonna fearmonger a little bit about ecstasy. Two people familiar with the encounter said, in some cases, Gaetz asked women to help find others who might be interested in having sex with him and his friends. And again, this part of it can only be considered serious because of the drug use involved. Federal laws indicate that prosecutors have filed trafficking charges against people suspected of providing drugs in exchange for sex, because feeding another person's drug habit could be seen as a form of coercion. So really, I mean, if there's any evidence or proof that took place, that's incredibly serious. But what I also find interesting, guys, is how, the Republican Party is really known for how cohesive it is, how they like look out for each other, how they never really turn on each other. I mean, there have been similar allegations, not similar, but there have been some pretty terrible allegations against other Republican lawmakers, and you'll see the party rally in support for the accused. In this case, we do not see that, and we're learning more about why. And so he made a lot of members of Congress uncomfortable. Apparently, he would show nude photos of the women that he had been sleeping with to members of Congress. I shared other uncomfortable details with you guys yesterday when we covered this story. And then Dana Bash gave some more details, because there's the creepy angle to it, and then there's the political retaliation angle to it, which I think is super fascinating. Let's take a look.
If you could see my text messages from some of his current and former colleagues, I actually can't repeat what some of them say on morning television. And it's because he has not made himself popular with most of his colleagues. And again, we're talking about his fellow Republicans, John. We're talking about people who he has antagonized in the name of being, as beholden and as loyal to the former president, Donald Trump, as possible, in the name of being on conservative media, being on Fox News, being the darling of that. And the most striking example of that was after the number 3 in his own party leadership, Liz Cheney, voted to impeach President Trump. He went to Wyoming and taunted her.
So there's a lot more division within the Republican caucus than we were aware of. Liz Cheney, of course, is not going to go back up Matt Gaetz. Really, there have only been 2 people, Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have come out in his defense. Alyssa, what do you make of that?
I think what you brought up earlier about, the Republicans do tend to be very cohesive. I think that's brought up a lot when we consider the different strategies that Democrats and Republicans have when it comes to politics in general, which I know isn't the point. But that is really interesting to see that now they're deciding to turn, and they're not gonna just follow Matt Gaetz down this path. And I think that they it also has to do with like, I don't want to go into like the whole political philosophy of it, but just, I don't know. My point is that they're starting to turn, and I think that is very interesting to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely interesting. But also, I mean, when you look at it in the context of how the Republican Party really defended Jim Jordan, who's dealing with some serious allegations himself. And the reason why is because it's all about like, hey, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? If you're gonna go out there and campaign against our fellow Republicans, like Liz Cheney, for instance, well, maybe when you're in a little bit of trouble, we're not gonna have your back. And that's what it appears like to me. That's my read of the situation. Wosny, last words on that.
Yeah, he's clearly part of a type of wave of politician who's basically, he's very cynical. He's very in it for himself. In many ways, he reminds me of Ted Cruz. I'm sure you guys as listeners will remember when he would insist on repealing Obamacare. Bring it to a vote. What are we doing? We're supposed to repeal this thing. And his colleagues are like, dude, you're just doing this to look tough. It's not good. We're not gonna repeal anything. We don't have the votes for it. Obama's the president. He's not gonna like veto his own freaking policy. Like, what are you doing besides making yourself look cool at the detriment of us? And you see that the same thing with Matt Gaetz. So now when it's time for you to get some help and you're out there on your own lingering, of course we're not gonna come save you. You've made a fool out of yourself at expense of all of us and in service of making yourself the center of attention, making yourself the show. So it doesn't surprise me, but again, the statement that came out of Matt Gaetz's office said, Matt Gaetz has never paid for sex. That's all you need to know about this cat. That's really all you need to know.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.